Hello Year 9 and welcome to Lesson 2 of Bayonet Charge, our English Literature Poetry study. Make sure you've got your pen, pad, poem and everything else that you need, and we will get started straight away with the next set of activities. Right, today's learning question is: how can I identify the key features of a poem on the first reading? So this one will be all about the first time we read a poem, what do we want to go through, what's our mental checklist, and by doing this we're laying down the foundations to be able to always gain an understanding of any poem we look at within a few minutes of first reading it. Now our first piece of vocabulary today is imagery. Imagery refers to a writer's use of vivid and descriptive language to add depth to their work. That is sensory imagery, which appeals to human senses to deepen the reader's understanding of the work. Powerful forms of imagery engage all of the senses. It's not just visual. So in Remains, the image of his bloody life in my bloody hands, which creates this image of violence. In Charge of the Light Brigade, the line "into the jaws of death, into the mouth of hell" creates the powerful image of the soldiers going to their deaths, the idea of them being swallowed up in hell, in flames, in smoke. And these create rich, deep connections for the reader to better understand what the poet's trying to communicate to us. So that technical term, imagery, is important. Method is our second piece of vocabulary today, and that refers to a way of doing something, a procedure that will achieve a specific result, an effect, or an outcome. Now, in literature, this refers to the ways in which a writer will try to create a certain mood or emotion, maybe to have an effect or an impact on the reader. It's what they do to get an effect. One method a writer can use to have an effect upon the reader is imagery, which we've just covered. And another method the writer might choose to use is structure, the way that the poem is put together and organized. So either of those could be methods, and we will be looking at both of those in a series of questions in this lesson. Today's activity centers around 10 questions which we can use to gain our first impressions of a poem. Now these 10 questions are the sorts of things that we should be asking every time we read a new poem, and they're always helpful for gaining an understanding of the meaning and the impact of a poem. Over time, these questions will become a habit for you, a mental checklist, and you'll find that you start to answer the questions without even consciously asking them. And when you get to that point, then you know you're really developing your skills as a reader of English and as an analytical student of English. So it's always worth practicing these. The questions are broken up into 4 boxes. We have a general overview box to start with, 3 questions. Then we have 4 questions centered around the method of the poem's structure. 2 questions built around 2 key pieces of imagery in the poem, statuary and the yellow hair. And finally, a bonus question: who's the speaker and who's the character? Now, that's quite important because speaker and character are not always the same, and it's really key that you remember that. People very often make the mistake of thinking the poet is writing about themselves, and they often are not. Before you answer these questions, I'm going to take you through a reading of the poem. I'd like to think about these questions while we read through. Suddenly he awoke and was running. Raw in raw seamed hot khaki, his sweat heavy, stumbling across a field of clods towards a green hedge that dazzled with rifle fire, hearing bullets smacking the belly out of the air. He lugged the rifle numb as a smashed arm. A patriotic tear that had brimmed in his eyes, sweating like molten iron from the centre of his chest. In bewilderment then, he almost stopped. In what cold clockwork of the stars and the nations was he the hand pointing that second? He was running like a man who has jumped up in the dark and runs listening between his footfalls for the reason of his still running, and his foot hung like statuary in mid-stride. Then the shot slashed furrows threw up a yellow hair that rolled like a flame and crawled in a threshing circle, its mouth wide open, silent, its eyes standing out. He plunged past with his bayonet toward the green hedge. King, honour, Human dignity, etc., dropped like luxuries in a yelling alarm to get out of that blue crackling air, his terror's touchy dynamite. So now we're back with these questions split into their categories, and I'd like you to make sure that you answer each of them in a full sentence to make sure that you're able to use them in the future for revision or reference notes. Some of these questions can be answered quite briefly, but others will require a longer and more in-depth answer, and you should think carefully about the answer to each question before you commit it to paper. Give yourself about 12 minutes or a little longer if you need it, and when that's done with, you can move on to the plenary. Right now, please pause the video and answer the questions. And finally for this lesson, a plenary where we look again at Remains and Bayonet Charge and make some comparisons. So we're just thinking about the key features of each poem, the imagery and the structure that they both use. Look back at the notes that you made for Remains to help with this, and make a few points in each column, things they have in common and things that are different. Think about how the poems achieve different effects, how they achieve maybe the same effect, and how they do that differently or in the same way. When that's done, you finish with this lesson, and you can move on to the next one as soon as you're ready. Thank you very much.